Morning, students, and welcome to today's lesson. We are starting a unit on ecology. So ecology covers chapters 3 through 7 in your book, but ecology is one large topic. And unlike cellular processes that get very, very detailed and specific, I find that ecology kind of works the best to learn it all hand in hand because it's taking a moment to learn to think ecologically as opposed to compartmentalize a lot of different tiny topics. So we're going to be trying to think ecologically, think about our ecosystem as opposed to memorize different specific details. And so because of that, we're going to be covering kind of a sprinkling of chapters 3 through 7. We're going to start out by looking at all of the things that you can be studying when you are studying ecology, because it's really quite vast, just like biology in general. And then we're going to take some time to figure out what we know about the Earth's abiotic factors. Remember, abiotic are things that are not alive, but they pertain to life. They contribute to life, things like water and soil and temperatures. We're going to be looking at those things first. Then we're going to take a look at biomes and where animals live and how biomes are distributed around the world. Then we'll study populations and population growth, and then interactions between those populations, and then finally the human impact on those biomes, those populations, and the ecosystem. So all of these things in the next few lectures, but today we're going to start out with a survey, kind of an overview of what ecologists can study. Ecological research is as diverse as research in biology itself. You can be studying health of a single organism or group of organisms, a population of the same species. You can be looking at the health of the organism, at its reproductive success, at its ability to find a mate. You can be looking at a population and whether they're evolving or what the selection pressures are on them and why those selection pressures exist. Above the population, we can start to look at the community. Who are all of the living factors, all the biotic factors in an environment? Who are the predators and who are the prey? Who's the competition? We can be looking at all of these different species and how they work together. As we move to the ecosystem, we start to consider the abiotic factors as well, things like weather and soil, winds, rainfall, those kinds of conditions. Eventually, we have to consider the landscape ecology. These are things like, are there mountain ranges in between? Are we changing altitudes? Has there been farming? What are we using? What do the humans use the land for? And finally, what does the health of our globe, of our world look like? And how can we affect it? How can we help to make our ecology safer and more sustainable for future generations? One really fundamental part of ecology is looking at seasonality. We know that there are seasons, there are times when the sun is more intense and less intense. Now here in Southern California, we basically have two seasons, hot and cold. We have kind of a winter season and then a summer season. But in most parts of the world, there is a very clear and distinct fall as the region may be cooling off, and then the spring as it heats back up. Now that's in the northern hemisphere where we are pretty familiar with living. But if you're in the southern hemisphere, as you know, in Australia, their summer is during our winter. And to explain all of that, we want to look at how the Earth is tilted in space. Over here, we have the sun, and we know, hopefully, that the Earth is going to revolve around the sun. Okay, so revolve around the sun means to go around each year. Of course, the Earth spins or rotates each day, but its revolution is around the sun and it takes it 365 days. The Earth is also slightly tilted. So what we can see is that in December, this is us up here in the United States, in December, we are slightly tilted away from the sun. And because we're tilted away from the sun, we have shorter days, longer nights, colder temperatures, less intense sun. And usually right in March, sometime in March, you may very likely get your first sunburn. You've been out in the sun all winter long when it was sunny. Then you go out in the sun suddenly in March and you come back in and you're sunburned and you think, what changed? Well, the Earth is actually shifting its axis so that from March to June, as the Earth revolves around the sun, it starts to tip the other way. And when it tips this other way, you can see that the United States just gets slightly closer to the sun. That makes the sun more intense. And then from June until December, we're slowly moving again away from the sun. So depending on the seasonality, you're going to see a more intense or less intense heat from the sun, more intense and less intense radiation from the sun. So as the Earth revolves around the sun, the tilt on its axis is what's going to increase or decrease the intensity of the sunlight. This doesn't just affect the weather, but it also affects wind patterns and seasonal ocean currents. So there is a lot of seasonality to the Earth based on its overall tilt and angle towards the sun. Another contributing factor to the weather, the overall abiotic factors in an environment, is the mountain ranges. So this is a very typical California looking chunk of land. You might have a longer section here before your mountain range. If you consider this mountain range like the Sierras, like Yosemite, what we see is we have the ocean right along the coast. And as we come in, San Luis Obispo, as you come in, we get a more inland area. And then eventually we're going to climb up into the Sierras. And on the other side of the Sierras, on the eastern side of the Sierras, we actually have a desert basin. And so if you've ever been to Lone Pine, or you've driven up to Tahoe or Mammoth from the inside of the Sierras, then you've seen that it looks really deserty. And what that has to do with is in our water cycle, we know that water gets picked up from the ocean by the clouds. And as those clouds move inland and they have to go up, up, up in altitude, it gets colder, and eventually the rain is going to fall out of the clouds and onto the mountains. So that's why we tend to get a lot of snowpack in our mountains. But as those clouds continue inland, we get a rain shadow. So we call this the leeward side of the mountain, the far side away from the ocean. We don't want to call it the north, the south, the east, or the west side because, I mean, what if you're on an island? You're surrounded by water everywhere. You could have a rain shadow on all of the interior portions of your island. If you're in the United States, if you're on the West Coast in California, you would see the leeward side on the eastern side. But if you were on the East Coast, you would see that the leeward side were on the west side of the mountain range. So it's not really a top, bottom, left, or right kind of situation. We have to use a different kind of term for that. So we call it the leeward side of the mountain. This helps to indicate the landscape of a particular region. And so we're going to be using this idea. This is where we can start to study the geological features as they pertain to a biome. Another important thing to consider are the ocean currents. There are a series of ocean currents that cycle around in our large major oceans, and they're very important for the traveling of animals, for the movement of bacteria, for the oxygenation, for the temperature. Keeping these ocean cycles, these ocean currents moving is a really important part of the health of our ocean ecology. With global change, with global temperature change and polar ice caps melting and bigger differences in temperature between the poles and the center equator of the Earth, we start to see a little bit of a lessening in the strength of these currents. And because of that, we end up having a change in the ocean biomes, a change in the ocean health. And so one of the things that as ecologists we need to look at is how does something like climate change affect abiotic factors like ocean currents. And how do those things work together? And so that's one of those things that ecologists need to do is ecologists need to be really big picture thinkers. They need to be thinking of the global ecology all the time. So not only does global climate change start to affect the gyres and the ocean currents, but it also affects the distribution of species. So as we see the global climate change, we're also going to see the movement of different species. So this is a particular type of tree that we used to see spread throughout the whole eastern seaboard. And so we would see this all the way from Alabama, all the way up, Georgia and Alabama, all the way up to Maine. We would see the same type of distribution of tree. As the temperatures have risen, it has gotten too warm for them in the south, and so they've had to move north. Of course, that's going to disrupt so many other things. What about the birds that live in these trees? What about the nests that they build? What about the competitors with other trees? What about squirrels? What about pollination and distribution and all these different components that are affected by the movement of this one species? And so when we study ecology, we're often looking for something that we'll call later a keystone species, a species that indicates to us the health on a much grander scale because of the impacts that it has on neighboring species. So those are some of the foundational things that we think of when we're considering the health of an environment. What we're going to do in our next time together is we are going to look at the different terrestrial biomes that we see on Earth. And we're going to be talking about whether they're affected by the rain shadow, or whether you would tend to find them on the leeward side of mountains, or whether the ocean current gyres affect the health of that particular biome. So we're going to be looking at these different biomes and starting to get a feel for all of them. Of course, you have done a more specific and in-depth study on the one biome that is a part of your case study that you're doing for your project in this chapter. The next time we get together for one of these videos, we will do a list of the terrestrial biomes, and then we'll move on to start to see how the organisms in those biomes begin to interact and grow.